Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Nakon vojnih intervencija u Čečeniji, Gruziji, Siriji, Kazahstanu i Ukrajini, brojni sigurnosni analitičari se pitaju koja je zemlja sljedeća na Putinovoj listi. Po svemu sudeći, to bi mogla biti Moldavija. U toj zemlji živi gotovo 4 miliona stanovnika. Veći dio te države pripadao je Rumuniji sve do 1940. godine kada je pripojena Sovjetskom savezu. Od sticanja nezavisnosti 1991. Moldavija se bori sa separatističkim tendencijama, prije svega u regiji Pridnjestrovlje. Proteklih sedmica sve više raste zabrinutost da bi se rat u Ukrajini mogao preliti na nju. Vlada samoproglašenog proruskog Pridnjestrovlja izdala je uzbunu za terorizam i podigla nivo sigurnosti, a Ukrajina tvrdi kako je riječ o lažnim napadima čiji je cilj i tu regiju uvući u rat. Krajem februara generalni sekretar NATO-a Jens Stoltenberg kazao je da ciljevi Rusije nisu ograničeni samo na Ukrajinu, te da se Moskva otvoreno protivi sigurnosnom poretku Europe. Posebno je skrenuo pažnju na sigurnosnu situaciju u Gruziji, Moldaviji i Bosni i Hercegovini, te pozvao zapadne zemlje da pruže više pomoći. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodni prilog.
Međunarodno nepriznata granica koja vodi ka zemlji koja zvanično ne postoji. Na punktu između Moldavije i njenog odmetnutog regiona Pridnjestrovlja je gužva, veća od uobičajene. Zbog talasa neobjašnjenih napada u ovom regionu, čiji je zapadni susjed Moldavija, a istočni Ukrajina, kontrole su pooštrene. Stanovništvo može preći bez specijalne dozvole. Novinari ne mogu. Građani su nervozni i zbunjeni onim što se dešava. Rat u Ukrajini vodi se tek 15 km od njih.
Pridnjestrovlje je proživjelo rat 90-ih, a rat znači samo jedno – krvoproliće. Ono što se dešava u Ukrajini je stravično.
U ponedjeljak se desio napad projektilom na zgradu službe sigurnosti u glavnom gradu regiona Tiraspolu. Narednog dana uništena su 2 radio-odašiljača iz sovjetskog doba, a u srijedu su, prema tvrdnjama regionalnih zvaničnika, iz Ukrajine ispaljeni hici na region, blizu ruskog skladišta oružja. Kijev napade naziva operacijama pod lažnom zastavom, izgovorom za Rusiju da mobiliše vojnike u regionu. Strah da bi ovo mogao postati novi front raste, dok Moskva poriče da želi kontrolu nad Pridnjestrovljem.
Snažno osuđujemo pokušaje da se Pridnjestrovlje uvuče u ono što se događa u Ukrajini. Čujemo senzacionalističke tvrdnje da se ruske mirovne snage, aerodrom u Tiraspolu i regruti u Pridnjestrovlju pripremaju za neprijateljstva.
Vjeruje se da je otprilike 1500 takozvanih ruskih mirovnjaka trajno stacionirano u Pridnjestrovlju. Tamo su od rata između separatista koje podržava Rusija i moldavskih vlasti početkom 90-ih. Region ima i vlastitu skromnu vojsku, nekoliko hiljada vojnika. Na ovoj strani granice je Moldavija, zemlja koja teži članstvu u Europskoj uniji. Na drugoj, zemlja koju niko nije priznao i koja i danas na svojoj zastavi ima sovjetski srp i čekić.
that still uses the Soviet hammer and sickle on its national flag.
Prije nekoliko dana moldavska predsjednica Maja Sandu rekla je da neimenovane snage unutar Pridnjestrovlja zagovaraju rat. Zemlja je prema Ustavu neutralna, ali ima bliske veze sa Europskom unijom i NATO-om, iako nije njihova članica. Ipak čini se da joj je rat u susjednoj Ukrajini sve bliže.
Idemo sada do New Orleansa gdje se nalazi Chuck Pfarrer, vojni analitičar i bivši pripadnik Seal Team 6. Chuck, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, how do you make sense of Russia's rather slow military advance in Ukraine? What went wrong with Russia's military planning?
Well, you know, one of the funny things is everything was going so right before this. Since their invasion in 2014, they had managed to make NATO irrelevant. They had managed to take Luhansk, Donetsk, annex Crimea, and everything had gone correct. And they had massed forces on the borders of Ukraine and gotten the entire world to focus on their issues. And they were going perfectly until the end of February this year when they invaded and things almost immediately started to go wrong.
Right. How would you assess Ukrainian battle tactics, and to what extent have Western-supplied Stingers, Javelins, and NLAWs helped Ukraine gain the upper hand on the battlefield?
Well, and that's an interesting thing, too. I think that what Russia had planned is to fight a European land war against Ukraine. And that plan that they wanted to use came right out of 1983, where they thought they were going to project a huge armored force onto the plains of Ukraine and fight what they thought an army that was going to behave like NATO did, which would mean to meet them with equal formations of armored force, etc. But that didn't happen. And as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, the battlefield switched, not to a conventional armor on armor battle, but to an asymmetrical fight. And that meant David against Goliath. And the Ukrainians have shown that they didn't meet the masses of Russian forces. They decentralized their resistance. They fought where the Russians were weakest. They fought them on their supply lines. They fought isolated positions, and they generally started to turn the entire conflict around. There were some things wrong with Russian tactics and equipment, and we've seen that spectacularly now. To take it from the very nuts and bolts level, Russian tank design had a big fault, and that was to reduce the number of crews, they switched to automatic loaders, which meant that the tank crew is sitting right on top of all the ammunition with no blowout panels. So the tanks were very susceptible to hits. The other thing that we saw, and other people and myself commented on the time, the Russians kept their people in the field on a battle-ready footing since November. And that took a lot out of the men and the equipment. And when it was time and important for those things to work perfectly, they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Now, why isn't Russia using more of its air force? It has one of the biggest air forces in the world, yet we have seen only a small fraction of it being employed over Ukraine.
Right. Remember, in the opening days of the conflict, when it started in March, Russia had tremendous success destroying Ukrainian aircraft on the ground, eviscerating their air defense systems, taking what appeared to be total control of the skies. Ukraine was able to save basically only a handful of aircraft, but importantly, they were able to disperse a small amount of their deep air defense capability. But what's happened in the meantime is many hundreds, thousands of man-pads, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons have flooded the battlefield. And this has changed the complexion of the air war. At least 4 out of 5 Russian airstrikes never even come into the airspace of Ukraine. They're launched from over Belarus, and they lob missiles onto Ukrainian targets. As the war goes forward, these missiles, they're going to make a tremendous difference in the conflict. They're already principally responsible for Russia not being able to put together a cohesive offensive in Donbass because they cannot integrate their frontal aviation to support the ground troops. And this is something that their war doctrine counted on since 1948.
So these are very old Soviet-era war tactics.
They are, and I think what we're witnessing right now, this is a moment in military history that is almost exactly like the Spanish Civil War, which preceded World War II, where all of a sudden war planners, war fighters in the world looked, and all of a sudden the technology of war had just changed utterly, and that's happened here. I call this the democratization of forward air control. You used to need a specialist airplane overhead with a specialist crew to look at the enemy and tell the ground forces where they were. Well, that meant you had to have fighters to cover the spotter airplanes and working all the way down. Now you can buy a drone literally at Walmart, send it up, and in the case of the Ukrainians, they put a laser on it, and they're flying a hobby store drone, pointing a laser at a Russian target and firing a laser-guided artillery shell 10 kilometers away for a direct hit. And that has changed everything.
Now, is America's goal to keep Russia bogged down in Ukraine for as long as possible, to make Russia bleed? And how will such a war impact Russian troop motivation and morale?
Well, I think that Russia is going to stay in Ukraine as long as Mr. Putin wants them to stay in Ukraine. And he wants Ukraine. The problem is he is already facing crises of morale throughout the entire ground force. Already, Ukraine has destroyed, what are the numbers this morning? It killed 24,000 troops and 1,092 main battle tanks.
Right.
I could tell you that if you're a soldier driving one of those tanks and you see that there are javelin missiles on the battlefield, and every time someone shoots a javelin missile, it has an 89% chance of killing a tank, they don't want to go forward anymore. We've already seen that the morale problem is so bad that Russia has had to come up with a series of rubber stamps to stamp the identification papers of their troops, saying this man has refused orders to go into combat, he's treacherous, etc. I'm not sure how much longer the morale of their troops is going to hold up. And we've seen in these piecemeal attacks, they cannot maintain military momentum because their troops are falling apart.
Right. Now, how can Ukraine drive Russian troops out of eastern parts of its territory, Russian troops that have entrenched themselves in Donetsk, Luhansk? And what sort of weapons will the Ukrainian military need? I suppose they'll need tanks and APCs, right?
Absolutely. There's a point at which, think of this as a tennis game. The ball came into the court from Russia. Russia thought it was going to be a conventional battle. Ukraine turned it into an asymmetrical struggle and had success. Now, there is a point, as you pointed out, that if Ukraine wants to regain its territorial sovereignty, it is going to have to launch counteroffensives against these places, Donetsk, Luhansk, perhaps even Crimea, where the Russians are dug in. Then it's going to come back to a conventional war of maneuver. That's the point at which the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, etc., that are being sent to Ukraine are going to come into effect. But again, the Ukrainian army is going to have an integrated force posture. They will by then reestablish their air defense. They'll probably get their Air Force going again. And a very key factor in all of this is NATO quality intelligence is informing Ukrainian battle commanders. So the whole entire element of surprise has been taken away from the Russian military because NATO is sending to the Ukrainians everything they know about the Russian situation. And that's had a terrible effect on the Russia's conduct of the war.
Right. And finally, Chuck, what message is the U.S. sending by beefing up its military presence in eastern parts of Europe in countries that are already NATO member states?
Well, one of the things I think, again, this falls on Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov, who said over and over and over and over again, we're not going to invade Ukraine. Well, that turned out to be a lie. They say over and over again, they're not going to invade NATO countries. Well, NATO can't count on that. And there used to be a joke, visit Russia before Russia visits you.
Right.
Well, NATO is very serious that they're not going any farther than Ukraine, and they need to get out of Ukraine also.
Right. Chuck, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on, Doctor. It was great to talk to you.
Poštovani gledalci, iz New Orleansa nam se uključio Chuck Pfarrer, vojni analitičar i bivši pripadnik Seal Team 6-a. U proteklih nekoliko sedmica više napada potreslo je istočni dio Moldavije, preciznije Pridnjestrovlje. Ali šta je zapravo Pridnjestrovlje? To je uski pojas teritorije između istočne obale rijeke Dnjestar i moldavske granice sa Ukrajinom. Regiju naseljava gotovo 470.000 ljudi. Etničkih Rusa i Ukrajinaca zajedno je više od Moldavaca. Dok je međunarodna zajednica smatra dijelom Moldavije, proruska teritorija je pod kontrolom separatista. Iako je proglasila samostalnost, nijedna zemlja, čak ni Rusija, ne priznaje tu teritoriju kao nezavisnu. Šta Pridnjestrovlje ima sa rusko-ukrajinskim konfliktom? Rusija u toj regiji ima otprilike 1500 vojnika koje Moskva naziva mirovnim snagama. Kijev je zabrinut da bi te snage mogle biti iskorištene za napad na Ukrajinu sa zapada. Rusija tamo održava vojne vježbe i tvrdi da je njihovo prisustvo ključno za održavanje mira unutar Pridnjestrovlja. Ta regija je gotovo u potpunosti ekonomski ovisna o Moskvi, koja joj između ostalog besplatno isporučuje plin. A kakvi su ruski interesi u Pridnjestrovlju? Rustam Minekajev, zamjenik zapovjednika Ruskog centralnog vojnog komiteta, nedavno je izjavio da je cilj Rusije preuzimanje kontrole nad jugom Ukrajine, što bi joj omogućilo pristup Pridnjestrovlju. Nejasno je hoće li ruska vojska, koja je angažovana u borbama na istoku Ukrajine, moći preuzeti još teritorije na jugu te zemlje i napredovati prema Moldaviji. Proteklih nekoliko dana pojačani su ruski vojni napadi na luku Odesu, čije je zauzimanje ključno radi spajanja teritorije sa Pridnjestrovljem. Ukrajinski predsjednik Volodymyr Zelenski upozorio je da je ruska invazija na njegovu zemlju samo početak, te da Moskva cilja i na zauzimanje teritorija u drugim državama. Moldavija nije dio NATO-a i od stjecanja nezavisnosti tražila je da ostane neutralna, što joj je ugrađeno i u Ustav. Postoji zabrinutost u vezi sa mogućnosti Moldavije da se odbrani od eventualne ruske invazije ako Putinove snage dođu do njene granice. Prošlog mjeseca Moldavija je, uz Gruziju i Ukrajinu, predala kandidaturu za članstvo u Europskoj uniji. Moldavija, koja se često naziva i slijepim crijevom Europe, mogla bi postati veća prijetnja starom kontinentu od rata u Ukrajini. Naime, kroz nju prolaze važni naftovodi i plinovodi, pa ako dođe do ruske invazije, mogla bi postati poligon za destabilizaciju Balkana, ali i Europe. Idemo sada do Tartua, gdje se nalazi Keith Harrington, stručnjak za bivše sovjetske republike. Keith, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, who do you think is responsible for the recent spate of shootings and bombings in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria? And does it appear to you that the war in Ukraine is already having a spillover effect on Moldova?
Well, just to touch on the first question as to who is responsible, of course, it's there's lots of different theories that I think it's important to mention as to different people claiming who may or may not be responsible. So, according to Moldovan President Maia Sandu, in an interview just after one of the incident that took place in Tiraspol when a building was attacked, the Ministry for Internal Security. She alleged that it was the result of infighting amongst political elites in Tiraspol, because right now the government, the current separatist regime, is very neutral, and she alleges that there's an element within the separatist regime that wants to actively partake in the war. Then, of course, the separatist regime themselves, the current de facto president, Vadim Krasnoselsky, he denied this and said it's the result of Ukrainians. But he was very careful not to blame the Ukrainian security forces. And he instead just said it was nationalist forces, which is, of course, a very vague term. And of course, you also have then the people who say that this is a Russian false flag operation as an excuse to intervene in Transnistria. And this is probably the most likely. I would say that it was a false flag most likely a false flag operation, maybe conducted with elements of the de facto elites, the separatist elites.
What would Russia's interest be in spreading its war to a tiny stretch of land along Moldova's eastern border? I mean, and what repercussions will this have on Moldova's NATO and EU accession plans?
Well, as we know, the war hasn't gone according to Putin's plan, and he's obviously constantly changing his objectives and what he wants. But in terms of Transnistria is part of this, at least in Putin's mind, this Novorossiya region that he's wanted to capture since at least 2014, which in his mind runs from the Donbass up to Transnistria. So if Putin was able to capture the southeastern portion of Ukraine and Transnistria, this would be a major victory in terms of his agenda that he's set out since annexing Crimea. And in terms of how it will impact Moldova's ambition, so As of right now, of course, Moldova is a neutral country, so they aren't looking for NATO membership officially. But in terms of their EU membership, it would obviously have a devastating impact. They already have a lot of trouble having a de facto state on their eastern border. So this would do even more damage. Any type of war, any type of violence there would push it further. And it's already a long time away. Moldova's EU accession. So this would just further push what's already a long-term plan back even further.
Now, from Russia's perspective, I mean, would reaching Transnistria require Russia to make enormous gains along Ukraine's southern coast, where Russian troops have been having trouble, making advancements over the last couple of weeks? Would it require Russia occupying Odessa, for example?
Oh, most certainly. There's no scenario where the small number of Russian troops in Transnistria cross into Ukraine and create a pincer movement. There's just not enough troops in Transnistria. So Russia would have to push through the Odessa district, which is a very, very big task, obviously. They're only making small to, at best, medium gains. The fighting has been raging there for over a month now. So obviously, there would be a big push through Odessa, which would probably cost a lot of lives, and it won't happen anytime soon. Right.
Now, Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe. It has about 4 million citizens. Its energy sector is completely dependent upon Russia. Now, talk us through Moldova's political orientation. I mean, there's a very strong pro-Moscow sentiment, but also very strong pro-European forces in Moldova.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a pretty strong political divide in Moldova. In recent years, there has been a shift, obviously, towards the West on a very much anti-corruption platform. So we had recently there was a pro-EU president, Maia Sandu, and then the following year, 2021, there was a EU government. So there has been a shift, but there is still a divide in Moldova. In the northern and southern regions, you still have a very much a pro-Russian orientation. Now, these, of course, are very sympathetic towards Ukraine. They've done a great job in Moldova across the political spectrum, taking in refugees, but you would still have people who wouldn't necessarily be embracing the West. The political divide is still pretty prevalent in the country.
Now, let me play the devil's advocate and ask you, what if President Putin decided to invade Transnistria and even perhaps annex it? What repercussions would this have on the stability of the Balkans and on the stability of Europe as a whole?
I mean, it would obviously have a massive impact because Putin's war has now spread into another country. I mean, it would be another country the victim of Russian aggression. So the question would be, where would it stop? Of course, there's a lot of people in Moldova who have Romanian NATO citizenship. It would bring the war even to yet another EU border. It would have, massive repercussions. And of course, in northern Transnistria, there is a munitions dump there that, if exploded, would have massive repercussions. It's full of old munitions, bombs from the Soviet era that can't be moved. And if any sort of bomb fell around that area, there could be serious environmental fallouts, loss of life. It would be a very, very big deal if Transnistria or Moldova got involved in the war. The knock-on effects could be massive.
Right. Keith, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Tartua nam se uključio Keith Harrington, stručnjak za bivše sovjetske republike. Rusiji je neophodna izlazna strategija iz Ukrajine jer su ulozi ruske elite veoma visoki. Ovo je za njih egzistencijalni rat i nijedan oligarh neće dugo trpjeti smanjivanje bogatstva zbog zapadnih sankcija. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.